In the small town of Freeport, Illinois, a young woman named Jennifer was preparing for what should have been the happiest day of her life. Born in 1972, Jennifer was known for her gentle nature and her love of helping others. She grew up in a loving family, with her mother working as a nurse and her father as a factory worker. Jennifer's friends described her as the kind of person who would go out of her way to make people smile, someone who believed in the good in everyone. Jennifer met her fiancé Daniel in 1994. Daniel was a charming man, a few years older than her, with a mysterious past that he rarely spoke about. From the beginning, there was something about him that attracted Jennifer. He was confident, always knew the right words to say, and had an air of authority that made people listen. He had grown up in a tough neighborhood in Chicago, and it was clear to Jennifer that his upbringing had been far from easy. But she believed that beneath his hard exterior, there was a good man who had simply made some wrong choices. Despite some initial concerns from Jennifer's family, who noticed that Daniel could be controlling at times, she defended him. She believed he had changed. Jennifer thought that once they were married, things would settle down and he would leave his troubled past behind for good. She saw herself as someone who could save him, someone who could help him become the man she knew he wanted to be. By 1996, just 2 years after they met, Daniel proposed. Jennifer's family, though still hesitant, supported her decision. After all, Jennifer seemed happy, and that was all they ever wanted for her. The wedding date was set for June 22, 1997, and the entire town of Freeport was looking forward to the big day. It was to be a beautiful ceremony held at the local church, with friends and family gathering to celebrate Jennifer and Daniel's union. But beneath the surface, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Daniel had been keeping secrets from Jennifer, hiding parts of his life that she had no idea about. Despite his promises to leave behind his old ways, Daniel had continued to engage in criminal activity. He had a history of violence and had been involved in illegal dealings that Jennifer was completely unaware of. More than that, he was still involved with a woman from his past, someone Jennifer had never even heard of. As the wedding day approached, Jennifer's friends noticed that she seemed more anxious than usual. They chalked it up to pre-wedding jitters, not realizing that Jennifer had started to doubt some of the choices she had made. She had heard whispers about Daniel's involvement with another woman, but whenever she brought it up, Daniel would quickly dismiss it, reassuring her that there was nothing to worry about. On the morning of the wedding, Jennifer's mother Mary helped her get ready. As she looked at her daughter in her white wedding dress, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had been against the marriage from the start, but Jennifer had been so determined to go through with it. Now, standing in the church, watching her daughter prepare to walk down the aisle, Mary prayed that her doubts were unfounded. As the guests filled the church, there was a feeling of excitement in the air. Everyone was eager to see Jennifer and Daniel exchange their vows. But as Jennifer stood at the entrance, about to walk down the aisle, a cold feeling washed over her. She couldn't explain it, but for a moment, she felt frozen in place. Still, she pushed the feeling aside and smiled as she began her walk towards Daniel, who was waiting at the altar. The ceremony proceeded smoothly, with everyone focused on the couple. Daniel, in his black suit, looked calm and composed. No one in the room could have predicted the tragedy that was about to unfold as Jennifer reached the altar. She locked eyes with Daniel for a brief moment. The world seemed to pause. The guests were smiling, the priest was ready, and Jennifer's family sat in the front row, watching with pride and emotion. She tried to convince herself that everything was going to be all right. She loved Daniel, and this was the beginning of their new life together. The priest began the ceremony, and the couple exchanged their vows. Daniel's voice was steady, his words carefully chosen. He spoke of love, loyalty, and a future together. As he slipped the ring onto Jennifer's finger, she smiled softly, her earlier doubts fading away in the warmth of the moment. She believed him. She believed in their future. But as the ceremony neared its end, something shifted in Daniel's expression. It was subtle, but enough for Jennifer to notice. His face, once calm and loving, became distant, cold even. The guests didn't notice. Everything was moving too quickly. The priest asked Jennifer if she took Daniel to be her husband. She opened her mouth to say, "Oh, I do," but before the words could leave her lips, Daniel suddenly stepped back. Without warning, Daniel reached into his jacket. What happened next unfolded so quickly that no one could react in time. In a swift, violent motion, Daniel pulled out a knife. Before Jennifer could register what was happening, Daniel plunged the blade into her chest. A gasp of horror rippled through the church as Jennifer collapsed to the floor, clutching at the wound, her white dress quickly turning red with blood. The church erupted into chaos. Screams filled the air as guests leapt to their feet, rushing toward Jennifer, but it was too late. Jennifer's mother, Mary, was the first to reach her daughter. She knelt by Jennifer's side, her hands trembling as she pressed them to the wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. But the wound was too deep. Jennifer's wide eyes were filled with shock and confusion, unable to comprehend what had just happened. She had trusted Daniel, she had loved him. How could this be real? As Mary cried out for help, Daniel stood frozen for a moment, the bloodied knife still in his hand. He didn't try to help Jennifer, nor did he show any sign of regret. His cold eyes scanned the crowd as if he were disconnected from the chaos he had just caused. Then, without a word, he turned and fled the church. The guests were in complete shock, paralyzed by the horror they had just witnessed. For a moment, no one moved. Then a few men in the crowd ran after Daniel, but he had already disappeared into the streets outside the church. Panic spread through the crowd as people realized the unimaginable. Daniel had just murdered Jennifer, the woman he was supposed to spend the rest of his life with, in front of all their family and friends. As Jennifer lay dying on the floor of the church, surrounded by the people who loved her, there was nothing anyone could do. Her breathing became shallow, her eyes slowly losing focus. In her final moments, Jennifer's thoughts must have been racing, trying to understand why the man she trusted had betrayed her in such a brutal way. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, but it was too late. Jennifer died in her mother's arms, her life cut short on the very day she was supposed to begin her future with Daniel. The scene was one of unbearable grief. Jennifer's mother was inconsolable, her cries filling the now eerily silent church. Her father stood frozen, his face pale with shock. The guests, who had come to celebrate a wedding, were left with a memory that would haunt them forever. A day that was supposed to be filled with love and happiness had turned into one of the darkest moments the town of Freeport had ever seen. As word of the tragedy spread through the town, people struggled to make sense of what had happened. How could Daniel, the man who had promised to love and protect Jennifer, do something so unthinkable? Why had he carried out such a brutal act in front of everyone they knew? But as investigators would soon uncover, the shocking events of that day were only the beginning of a dark and twisted story. In the hours following the murder, the town of Freeport was in a state of disbelief. How could something so horrifying have happened in broad daylight in a place meant for love and unity? Local law enforcement immediately launched a manhunt for Daniel, but he had seemingly vanished without a trace. The entire community was left shaken, searching for answers. As the investigation progressed, the police began to unravel a darker side of Daniel's life, one that Jennifer had only caught glimpses of but never fully understood. While on the surface, Daniel appeared to be a charming and reformed man, his past told a very different story. Daniel had grown up in one of Chicago's most crime-ridden neighborhoods, where survival often meant aligning with dangerous people. He became involved with criminal gangs at a young age, starting with petty crimes before escalating to more serious offenses. By the time he was in his early 20s, Daniel had developed a reputation as a man who could not only get things done, but also had a violent streak that kept others at bay. Despite his promises to Jennifer that he had left this life behind, Daniel never truly escaped his past. In fact, during the months leading up to the wedding, he had been secretly reconnecting with old criminal associates, finding himself once again drawn into a web of illegal activity. But it wasn't just his ties to crime that threatened his relationship with Jennifer. Investigators soon discovered that Daniel had been involved with another woman named Lisa, someone he had known long before he met Jennifer. Unlike Jennifer, Lisa was fully aware of Daniel's dark side, and it seemed that she not only accepted it but encouraged it. The police uncovered evidence suggesting that Daniel had never truly ended things with Lisa despite his engagement to Jennifer. This affair, combined with his inability to break free from his criminal connections, created a dangerous tension in Daniel's life, one that would eventually lead to Jennifer's death. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they began to believe that Daniel's decision to kill Jennifer wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act of violence, but something he had planned in the days leading up to the wedding. His involvement with Lisa and his return to a life of crime may have driven him to see Jennifer as an obstacle, someone who was standing in the way of the life he wanted to lead. Jennifer's love and belief in him were now a burden, something that conflicted with the darker path he had chosen. But there was another element to Daniel's mindset that disturbed investigators even more. Interviews with some of Daniel's old acquaintances revealed that he had begun to exhibit increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior in the weeks before the wedding. He had spoken of feeling trapped, of wanting to escape his responsibilities, and there were hints that he saw Jennifer not as a partner, but as someone he needed to get rid of. The image of the perfect wedding and the loving future that Jennifer had envisioned had become twisted in Daniel's mind into something threatening, a trap from which he had to escape at any cost. Meanwhile, the town of Freeport mourned. Jennifer's family was devastated not only by her death, but by the cruel manner in which it had happened. Her mother, Mary, couldn't shake the image of her daughter lying in her blood-stained wedding dress, and her father struggled to comprehend the loss. Friends and relatives gathered to support them, but nothing could erase the trauma of what had taken place in that church. As the investigation deepened, the police focused their efforts on finding Daniel. They searched the surrounding areas, set up roadblocks, and interviewed anyone who might have seen him after he fled the church. For days, there were no solid leads, and it seemed as though Daniel had vanished into thin air. But they knew that a man like Daniel couldn't hide forever. He had too many connections, too many ties to his criminal past that could eventually lead to his downfall. Then, just when it seemed that the trail had gone cold, a breakthrough came. A tip from a truck driver passing through a nearby town suggested that Daniel had been spotted at a remote gas station, accompanied by a woman matching Lisa's description. The police raced to the location, hoping they were finally closing in on the fugitive. But as they would soon learn, Daniel wasn't planning to go quietly. He had no intention of facing justice for what he had done to Jennifer. The manhunt was about to reach a dangerous and deadly conclusion. As the police followed the tip from the truck driver, they intensified their search around the remote gas station. They soon discovered that Daniel and Lisa had been spotted a few miles away at a rundown motel just off the highway. Authorities quickly mobilized, preparing to close in on the location where Daniel was hiding. The police had already pieced together that Daniel had been on the run with Lisa since the wedding day. It became clear that Lisa had been more than just a bystander in this tragic event. She had been helping Daniel evade capture, fully aware of what he had done to Jennifer. As investigators delved deeper into Lisa's past, they found that she had a criminal record of her own, involving theft and drug-related offenses. It seemed that her connection with Daniel went far beyond a casual relationship. They were partners in crime, both figuratively and literally. With this new information, law enforcement knew they needed to act fast. They couldn't risk Daniel and Lisa slipping away again. The motel was surrounded in the early hours of the morning, and a tactical team was brought in to assist with the raid. The police hoped to capture Daniel without incident, but they were prepared for the worst. After all, Daniel was a man with a violent past, and they knew he wouldn't hesitate to use force to escape. As dawn broke, the officers made their move. They stormed the motel, breaking through the door of the room where Daniel and Lisa were hiding. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. Daniel was armed and ready to fight. A brief but intense standoff ensued as police ordered Daniel to drop his weapon. But instead of surrendering, Daniel turned the gun on the officers, firing multiple shots in a desperate attempt to escape. The police returned fire, and within moments, it was over. Daniel was fatally shot in the exchange, his life ending in the same violent way he had chosen to live it. Lisa, who had been standing by his side, was taken into custody without further resistance. As the dust settled, the motel room was eerily silent, the final chapter of Daniel's life having played out in a storm of gunfire and tragedy. For the people of Freeport, there was a bittersweet sense of closure. Daniel's death meant that he would never be able to hurt anyone again, but for Jennifer's family, it was a hollow victory. The man who had murdered their daughter was gone, but so was Jennifer. Nothing could bring her back, and the grief of her loss still weighed heavily on everyone who had known her. In the days following Daniel's death, investigators continued to question Lisa, trying to understand her role in the events leading up to Jennifer's murder. Under pressure, Lisa admitted that she had been in contact with Daniel throughout his engagement to Jennifer. She knew about the wedding, knew that Daniel had been struggling with the idea of marrying Jennifer, and she had encouraged him to break things off. But instead of simply leaving Jennifer, Daniel had chosen a far darker path, one that Lisa claimed she hadn't expected, despite her attempts to downplay her involvement. It was clear to investigators that Lisa had been complicit in helping Daniel escape after the murder. She had driven him from the church, hidden him in motels, and even supplied him with money and weapons to avoid capture. For her role in aiding and abetting a fugitive, Lisa was charged and eventually sentenced to several years in prison. Though she hadn't physically participated in Jennifer's murder, Her actions in the aftermath made her guilty of supporting the man responsible for the crime. As the case came to a close, the town of Freeport tried to move on, but the memory of Jennifer's tragic death lingered. Her family struggled with the weight of their grief, holding on to the memories of the kind and loving daughter they had lost. The wedding that had turned into a nightmare would be remembered as one of the darkest days in the town's history. The story of Jennifer's murder was a sobering reminder of the dangers that can lie beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect relationships. Her unwavering belief in Daniel's goodness, despite the warning signs, had cost her everything. And though justice had been served, the loss of her life was a wound that would never fully heal for those who had loved her. After Daniel's death and Lisa's imprisonment, the town of Freeport was left to grapple with the aftermath of a tragedy that had shattered the illusion of safety in their small community. Jennifer's funeral was held a few weeks after the incident, attended by hundreds of people from Freeport and beyond, all wanting to pay their respects to the young woman whose life had been so cruelly taken. The church, the very place where Jennifer had been killed, was filled with flowers, and the atmosphere was one of deep sorrow. Her parents, Mary and Robert, were inconsolable, their grief almost too heavy to bear. It was difficult for anyone in the town to forget what had happened in that church, and for many, the image of Jennifer in her wedding dress lying on the floor, covered in blood, remained etched in their minds. In the months following the tragedy, the community rallied around Jennifer's family. Vigils were held in her memory, and friends and neighbors provided as much support as they could. But for Mary and Robert, life would never be the same. The loss of their only daughter left a void that nothing could fill. Mary often spoke of the guilt she felt, how she had sensed something was wrong on the day of the wedding but hadn't been able to stop it. Robert, a man of few words, withdrew into himself, finding it difficult to speak about the daughter he had loved so deeply. As time passed, the details of the investigation continued to come to light. It was confirmed that Daniel had planned Jennifer's murder well in advance. He had confided in Lisa that he felt trapped by the idea of marriage and had no intention of starting a new life with Jennifer. The pressure of living a double life, one as an assumed-to-be husband and the other as a man involved in criminal activity, had become too much for him. Rather than walking away from the relationship, Daniel chose a path of violence. Lisa's role in the crime was also examined closely. Although she hadn't physically committed the murder, she had encouraged Daniel's growing resentment towards Jennifer, fueling his paranoia and pushing him further into a dark, destructive mindset. The police uncovered phone records and letters between Daniel and Lisa, revealing how deeply entwined she was in the events leading up to the murder. While Lisa denied knowing that Daniel would kill Jennifer on their wedding day, many believed she had played a much larger role than she admitted. In the years that followed, Jennifer's story became a symbol of both loss and the dangers of ignoring red flags in relationships. Her case was studied by domestic violence advocates and legal experts, who pointed out the warning signs that had been missed: Daniel's controlling behavior, his criminal background, and his secret relationship with Lisa. For many, Jennifer's tragic death served as a reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing toxic behavior before it escalates into something far worse. Mary and Robert eventually established a foundation in Jennifer's name, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic abuse and raising awareness about the dangers of controlling relationships. They wanted to ensure that no other family would have to endure the pain they had suffered. The foundation held yearly events to honor Jennifer's memory, providing a space for survivors of domestic violence to share their stories and find support. Though the pain of losing Jennifer would never fully fade, her parents found some solace in helping others. Mary, in particular, became a strong advocate for early intervention in abusive relationships, speaking at schools and community centers about the importance of recognizing the signs of danger. Her message was clear: love should never hurt, and no one should ever feel trapped or afraid in a relationship. Jennifer's story remains a heartbreaking example of how quickly a dream can turn into a nightmare. What was supposed to be the happiest day of her life had turned into a horrific tragedy that no one could have foreseen. Her trust and love for Daniel, despite the warning signs, had ultimately led to her untimely death. But through her parents' efforts and the community's commitment to remembering her, Jennifer's legacy became one of hope and prevention, ensuring that her story would not be forgotten and that others could learn from the devastating consequences of ignoring the warning signs in toxic relationships.